Welcome to the debate. If you ask an archaeologist to excavate an ancient site, they don't, walk in with a museum plaque already written.
Right, they don't just hunt for this specific shiny artifact that matches a preconceived description.
Exactly. They grid the dirt, they sift, they catalog literally every shard of pottery before they even begin to theorize what the civilization actually looked like.
Yet when we look at how professionals document their own careers, they almost always start with the plaque.
They start by trying to write the perfect resume bullet.
Yes, which is wild.
So today, we are exploring the intellectual and practical friction within the methodology of documenting professional work.
And it's a fascinating tension, honestly, because the central disagreement we are tackling today is whether we can actually, stop ourselves from writing that plaque in our heads. We are examining the doctrine of capture first, claim later, render last.
Which is the core of Module 4 of the curriculum.
Right. So, does enforcing a strict sequential barrier between gathering raw professional evidence, the capture phase, and formulating the final narrative, the claim or the rendering, does that actually produce a more accurate and ethical record? Or is the complete isolation of capture from rendering just, a psychological illusion, given that human beings inherently filter what they capture based on what they eventually intend to claim?
I will be defending the curriculum's strict sequence. I argue that prematurely focusing on output, like a polished resume bullet or a LinkedIn summary, it fundamentally corrupts professional truth.
A strong accusation.
But a true one. Human memory is highly malleable, and when ego and the pressure to impress are introduced too early, the only way to preserve accuracy is to enforce a rigid, intellectual firewall between gathering evidence and writing the story.
Well, and I will be arguing that while gathering raw evidence is absolutely vital, no argument there, the act of capture is always inevitably guided by the shadow of the intended rendering.
You don't think you can separate them?
No, you cannot sift the dirt without knowing what gold looks like. The idea of a completely objective, isolated capture phase is conceptually flawed, even if it is well-intended.
All right, well, let me lay out the defense of capture first, claim later, render last. Clients usually arrive to an advisor with fragments.
Oh, definitely. A total mess of fragments.
Right, they have fuzzy memories, isolated files scattered across a dozen drives, or maybe drafts of their work history that have been wildly inflated by an AI tool. If an advisor jumps straight into polishing a profile or asking AI to make the client sound stronger, it leads directly to overclaiming.
Which helps nobody.
Exactly. Ironically, it actually erases the professional's true nuanced contribution. So the central doctrine of Module 4 is simple. Capture first, claim later, render last. The first act of record building is not writing a resume bullet.
No, it's not.
It is not polishing a profile. It is not asking ChatGPT to make you sound like a visionary leader. The first act is pure capture.
And look, I completely agree that jumping straight to generative AI for an inflated resume bullet is a terrible practice. We've all read those profiles that sound like, a robot swallowed a corporate jargon dictionary.
Right. The spearheaded, the synergistic paradigms nonsense.
Exactly. But I come at it from a different way when we talk about the methodology itself being a pure isolation chamber.
Let me finish the thought, though, because the actual mechanics of the capture phase matter deeply here. The advisor helps the client turn one manageable piece of work into a highly structured source entry.
Using the evidence inventory tools?
Yes, Tool 1B. That entry isn't a narrative, it's a grid. It must include the raw evidence, the business context, absolute clarity on their specific role, what we call measure clues, a list of witnesses, privacy boundaries, and notes on what claims this might eventually support, or crucially, what claims to avoid.
Okay, but notice how you just said,
Wait, let me just land this point. The output of this initial phase is not a polished surface. The output is source material that later renderings must answer to. Evidence needs context, context needs role clarity, and this mechanism only works if the final claim is entirely removed from the professional's mind during capture.
And again, it is a noble ideal. But capture first, claim later is an impossible ideal.
Why impossible?
Because the curriculum itself instructs advisors to help clients choose a capture scope that is, quote, meaningful enough to matter, It asks advisors to prompt clients with questions like, what work might support a future claim?
Well, you have to start somewhere.
Right. But you cannot evaluate what is meaningful without a hypothetical claim already operating in the background. True capture is always informed by a filtering mechanism based on the desired final rendering. You are always working backward, even if you refuse to admit it.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If you acknowledge a filtering mechanism, you have to acknowledge the immense distortion it brings to human memory.
Distortion is a strong word.
But it's accurate. When you rush to write a resume bullet, you fundamentally distort reality because you are optimizing for impact, not truth. The curriculum explicitly warns against using prompts like, tell your story.
Right, because storytelling encourages fiction.
Exactly. Focusing on the output first causes people to invent metrics. They take what the curriculum calls a measure clue, like knowing intuitively that the volume of help desk tickets went down.
Sure.
And because the resume demands a hard number, they just invent decreased ticket volume by 20%. The demand of the rendering creates a fiction.
But let's look closely at the nature of a measure clue. The curriculum defines it as observing things like how long a process took before versus after, or whether managers actually relied on a new dashboard.
Which is purely empirical observation.
Is it, though? How do you identify a relevant measure clue without knowing what metric would be impressive to an audience? How can you identify relevant constraints without implicitly working backward from a narrative of success?
I disagree with the premise that you need a narrative to spot a constraint.
A constraint is only recognizable as a constraint if it stood in the way of a goal you want to brag about later. The goal is the claim.
Think of it like a crime scene investigation, okay?
Okay, I'll bite.
If a detective walks into a room and only collects evidence that supports a pre-decided theory of the crime, the claim, they miss the actual truth. They might ignore a muddy footprint because it doesn't fit their timeline of when the suspect arrived.
A classic confirmation bias problem.
Exactly. In this system, the strict evidence inventory forces you to log work products, decisions, outcomes without asking, what did you accomplish? Because asking, what did you accomplish, immediately triggers that ego-driven, narrative-spinning part of the brain.
So you just log everything.
We ask, what did you create? What did you fix? What did you maintain? We collect the footprints without deciding who the culprit is.
That is a compelling argument. But detective, you only walked into that specific room because someone called in a murder.
That's a bit of a stretch of the metaphor.
No, it's not. The claim of a murder is what got you to dust for prints in the first place, which brings me to the reality of doing this work. Okay, in theory, gritting the dirt sounds great.
It is great.
But let's step into the real world for a second. If I am a professional with a 15-year career, you're asking me to sift through a mountain of dirt. The sheer volume of emails, projects, and meetings is paralyzing. The overwhelm is going to stop me before I even start.
Yes, full career overwhelm is a massive problem, which is exactly why clients usually fail when they try to document everything at once. But the doctrine solves this.
By forcing them to do it blindly?
No, by insisting the client start with a scope that is explicitly small enough to finish. Just one single project, one difficult season, or even one specific artifact, like a complex spreadsheet they built.
Right.
Then we use tool 1C, the evidence to claim summary, and it acts purely as a bridge. It prevents the advisor from turning a pile of notes into a final claim prematurely. It asks what evidence is strong, what needs more context, and completely halts the rush to publish.
But let me challenge you there. Selecting that specific scope, choosing to document one difficult season over another, or focusing on the CRM migration instead of daily team management, is essentially making a massive claim about what defines the professional's value.
I don't see it as a claim. I see it as a starting point.
You are deliberately sifting the dirt where you already suspect the gold is. The curriculum even suggests asking the client, what work is on your resume but not well supported by evidence?
Yes, to fix the gaps.
But that proves that the prior rendering the resume is explicitly directing the capture process. It contradicts the idea that capture happens entirely first and independent of the claim. The claim is pointing the flashlight.
That's an interesting point, though I would absolutely frame it differently.
Using a poorly supported resume bullet as a starting point isn't letting the claim direct the capture.
How is it not?
It's using a known failure point to initiate an archaeological dig. It's saying, we have this plaque, but there are absolutely no artifacts in the museum to back it up. Let's dig in this specific spot and see if the artifacts actually exist.
And if they don't?
We tear down the plaque. That distinction is critical because it brings us to how human judgment and narrative structure inevitably try to sneak into the raw data. I want to focus deeply on what the curriculum calls contribution truth.
Wait, hold on. I understand the concept of wanting truth, but how do you objectively isolate someone's specific contribution in a modern, highly collaborative corporate environment? Where is the line between raw data and interpretation?
The line is drawn at role clarity and verb accuracy.
Verb accuracy?
Yes. Skipping straight to the claim causes professionals to universally use the biggest verb possible. They want to say they spearheaded or led a massive initiative. But the curriculum emphasizes that role clarity during capture is paramount.
Did you actually own the work or just help out?
Exactly. Did you lead it? Or did you coordinate it, maintain it, or simply support it? Let me give you a detailed scenario. A client wants to claim they led a CRM migration that boosted sales by 20%.
A very common type of claim.
Right. If you jump to the claim, you just try to polish that sentence, but when you do a governed capture, you force them to list the artifacts. And guess what? You find out they didn't lead the migration. The IT director did.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Client's actual verified contribution was maintaining the data mapping checklist and coordinating the training schedules. The strict capture system preserves that nuanced judgment. Furthermore, the methodology relies on a before-after difference framework.
Let's talk about that framework, because I think that's where the isolation chamber really starts to crack.
Let me explain how it functions first before you dismantle it.
Go ahead.
Before asks what the situation was factually. After asks what was different in the environment. Difference asks what changed, for whom, and under what exact conditions.
Right.
This objectively ensures that vague, qualitative claims of improvement are grounded in factual, observable changes in the business. Was the process faster? Was it safer? Was it less dependent on a single bottleneck person? It forces the professional to be empirical rather than aspirational.
Okay, look, I completely acknowledge the strength of demanding accurate verbs. It protects against both the inflation of the ego and the tragic erasure of a person's true day-to-day contribution.
Thank you.
But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the before-after difference framework is purely empirical.
Why not?
Because identifying the difference out of a complex business environment is an inherently narrative act. It is not just raw data capture.
I disagree. It's observing physics.
Let's go back to your CRM migration example. Out of 1,000 things that change after that software was implemented, deciding what difference matters requires a perspective on what the market or the next employer values.
Not necessarily.
Yes, necessarily. The difference could empirically be that the servers now run 3 degrees hotter. The difference could be that the marketing team sends fewer emails. Or the difference could be that the finance team saves 20 hours a week on reconciliation.
Right.
You, as the professional, choose to document the 20 hours saved because that is a specific claim you intend to render. You completely ignore the server temperature. The narrative is driving the observation.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. Defining what changed and for whom is an empirical observation of a business outcome, not a marketing spin.
But choosing which outcome to record is the spin.
If we look at a simpler example from the curriculum, a basic onboarding checklist. Without context, it's just a Word document. But through structured context reconstruction, you observe that before the checklist, the team had high turnover and managers repeated the same instructions verbally every week.
Okay.
After the checklist, new hires had a shared asynchronous reference. The difference is that the onboarding process became less dependent on one manager's memory. That isn't a narrative spun for a hiring manager. It is the structural reality of what occurred in the business.
But
Wait, the fact that the job market happens to value efficiency and scalability is secondary to the fact that it objectively, observably happened. You are capturing the physics of the business change, not writing a commercial for it.
the decision to reconstruct the context around that specific onboarding checklist, rather than the hundreds of other emails, memos, or meeting agendas that person produced that exact same week, is driven by the gravitational pull of the rendering.
I wouldn't call it a gravitational pull.
You are preparing for claim mapping. The curriculum literally states that the entire apparatus of creating a context brief is preparation for mapping claims later on. You are building a bridge, and a bridge implies a destination.
That doesn't mean the bridge itself is the destination.
The rendering is pulling the entire capture process forward, dictating what is worth observing in the first place.
The preparation for a claim is not the same as the authoring of the claim. And keeping those two acts distinctly separate brings us to perhaps the most critical, high-stakes reason this intellectual firewall must exist.
Which is?
Privacy boundaries and the handling of imperfect evidence. The doctrine states very clearly, privacy begins at capture. Let's look at the psychological behavior here. If a professional is entirely focused on rendering a claim, if their brain is locked on to trying to write that impressive, metric-heavy bullet point, they become highly vulnerable to exposing confidential data.
Oh, absolutely. Employer-owned data, patient data, you name it.
Because they want the bullet to sound undeniably impactful, they copy and paste real revenue numbers into ChatGPT to have it rewritten. Or they name a sensitive client just to borrow their prestige.
Proof is not permission. The curriculum is incredibly strong on this point, and honestly, I think it is one of the most vital insights in the entire system. Just because you can prove you did something doesn't mean you have the right to publish it.
Exactly. The rigorous doctrine ensures that metadata-only notes, heavy redactions, or safe, anonymized summaries are established before any public-facing story is crafted.
You set the rules of engagement early.
You ask, is this employer-owned data? Can the scope be redacted? Should it be entirely excluded from the public record? You establish the ethical and legal boundary while it is still just raw source material.
Right.
Furthermore, the system mathematically accommodates imperfect evidence. If a client only has a fuzzy memory of a project they did 4 years ago and the actual files are lost at an old laptop, the system doesn't just throw the memory out.
It logs it.
But it also doesn't let them instantly claim it as fact. It marks it as a memory-based entry that actively needs confirmation. This proves the methodology values the integrity of the source over the polish of the output. It refuses to let a memory become a claim without corroboration.
The privacy protocols are arguably the most robust and necessary part of the entire framework. Establishing whether evidence is metadata only or requires redaction at the point of capture is brilliant, especially in an era where people overshare corporate data constantly.
So you agree the isolation works?
Hang on, let's look at that imperfect evidence for a moment. Capturing a memory-based entry and leaving it as an unverified node in a database is only useful if there is an eventual intention to render it.
It's logging the truth of their experience.
You wouldn't expend the cognitive effort to log a fuzzy memory about a project from 4 years ago if you didn't desperately hope it could eventually cross the bridge to become a verified claim on your resume.
But that is exactly why the firewall works. You log the memory, you mark it unverified, and you stop. The methodology physically prevents you from taking the next step.
Right, but
You do not let it cross the bridge into the resume or the interview prep sheet until witnesses or actual artifacts are found. The system restrains the human impulse to just wing it.
the architecture of the context brief, which summarizes the situation, the role, the difference, the privacy limits, is explicitly designed as a bridge. My point is not that the system is broken, quite the opposite. I think it is a phenomenal, rigorous system.
Glad we agree on that.
But my point is that the doctrine capture first, claim later is ultimately a useful fiction. It's a psychological trick played on the client to get them to slow down and stop hallucinating their own achievements.
A trick?
Yes, the advisor and structurally the methodology itself is always navigating by the stars of the eventual claim.
A useful fiction. I think calling it a fiction undermines the empirical rigor of what is actually happening. Keeping an intellectual firewall between capture and rendering is the only way to protect professional truth from the massive, modern pressures of overclaiming, AI inflation, and privacy exposure.
I hear you, but
When you sit down to take an evidence inventory, you are gridding the archaeological site. You are forcing the professional to confront what they actually did, whether they led, coordinated, or just maintained a spreadsheet, before their ego is allowed to think about how it sounds to a hiring manager. That sequence is not a psychological trick. It is a structural necessity for evidence literacy. If you blend the two, the narrative always consumes the truth.
And I maintain that while intellectual charity requires admitting the extreme danger of premature polishing, I mean, the AI-inflated nonsense we see everywhere on LinkedIn today is proof of that. True blind capture is impossible without the guiding light of the eventual claim.
We might just have to disagree on the purity of the sequence.
Fair enough. You grid the archaeological site in that specific desert because you already know what a civilization looks like and you want to find one. The capture and the rendering are not sequentially isolated. They are in a constant symbiotic feedback loop. You capture evidence to support a claim, the evidence modifies the claim, the new claim requires different evidence.
Yet, despite that fundamental disagreement on the purity of the sequence, we actually have a very strong point of convergence here.
We do.
We both completely agree that the traditional model of career documentation, jumping straight from a flawed human memory directly to writing a resume bullet, is fundamentally broken. It either inflates reality into fiction or, tragically, it erases the actual nuanced daily contributions of the professional.
Absolutely. Looking at professional documentation, not as a creative storytelling exercise or an exercise in personal branding, but as a rigorous exercise in evidence literacy, is a massive paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
We are moving away from asking, how do I sound? And moving toward, what can I prove? And what did I actually change? And there is so much more to explore here, particularly regarding how those early measure clues we debated eventually transition into fully verified metrics without losing their contextual honesty.
It really leaves us with a profound question about the nature of how we document our own histories. Can we ever truly separate what we objectively observe about our past from what we desperately intend to say about it in the future? When we stand at the edge of our own professional archaeological site, can we simply catalog the artifacts as they are, or are we always, inevitably, already writing the plaque?
Definitely something to think about.
Until next time.